Now, I don't think I really need to introduce Lord Browne. I think his biography is well known. It was sent out in the invitation, of course. Let me just touch on a couple of the highlights that I'm just reminding you, I'm sure you all know. After educated at Cambridge and Stanford in natural sciences and business, John Boyd joined BP as a university, actually an apprentice it was called in those days, wasn't it? It's interesting how the world goes cycling back in 1966. After 20 years of working upstream assignments around the place, John became the treasurer and chief executive of BP Finance in 1984 and was appointed as group chief executive in 1995. And that period of huge success for BP, the big mega merger, if you remember, with Amoco, and then leaving after 12 years in 2007. And from a personal perspective, John, I can still remember being a junior exec in the oil business, and great joy at getting an invitation that somebody else couldn't go to the IP lunch on a Monday, where you were the speaker actually in 1998, that was. Fond memories. John was voted the most admired chief executive by management today for 4 consecutive years between 1999 and 2002, 90 in 1998, and made a life peer in 2001. Again, if you look at the biography, you'll see the huge list of things that John does today, which are too many to mention, but still massively involved in the energy industry through L1 Energy and as co-chairman of Wintershall Dea, which is, I think you're saying, now the world's largest, possibly, independent oil and gas company. And through other things, through working with Accenture and a whole series of boards in which John is an advisor on, has a massive span across so many sectors and industries. In 2006, I don't know if you remember this day, John, but back to your Amoco merger, I was leading National Grid and was facing a huge conundrum in the US at the time on how to manage the politics of a large transaction in the United States. And John very kindly spent half a day with me, pointing me in the right direction, for which I remain hugely grateful. It helped me over the line, actually. Over the past 10 years, I've got to know John, in particular through your role as the president of the Royal Academy of Engineering and the chairman of the Q Prize, which John still does. I think I can say we share a passion about the importance of engineering and how to get a younger generation really interested in engineering. That is where I can not draw a line of similarities between John and I, because everything else I stand back in awe, not least having been such a successful business leader for so long, to then turn to the art of writing books, which I personally can't imagine you get that skill. And here we are this evening talking about not the first book, but actually the 5th book in a series, Make, Think, Imagine, Engineering, the Future of Civilization. Let's take a poll. Who's read the book in the room at the moment? Okay, so we've got a lot of people who are going to get convinced from this evening to go and buy the book, hopefully. Let me just give you a couple of headlines before I some questions here. It is a tour de force, it really is. What intrigued me most is the fact you go right back to the beginning of civilization, the importance of inventions like the astrolabe, the Harrison chronometer, even the stirrup, the horse's stirrup. I'd never thought of that as a piece of engineering in a sense, which I enjoyed. And touching on some of the things that I would have identified with, people who invented things and caused the application that changed the world. Otis with elevators, Parsons with steam turbines, Whittle with the jet engine, Morse with the telegraph, of course, and telephony. And then coming right up to date with people who, in fact, Q Prize winners, Berners-Lee and Vint Cerf, the introduction of the internet, and Robert Lang with all his amazing work in biomedical. So I can recommend it. It's just a tour de force across so many things that you might not necessarily think of. Welcome back, John. It's nice to have you back at the Energy Institute as an honorary fellow. So where to start? Let me start, if I can, with a question that I'm genuinely interested in. Having written 4 books already on other subjects, what was it that caused you to think I want to write a book about engineering?
Oh. Well, good evening. I spend a lot of time in my life being involved in many cultural institutions, from the British Museum, the Tate Galleries, the Court of Artists of Art, the Donmar Warehouse. I've got quite a big list. And so I'm surrounded by people who talk to me about what they call culture and civilization. And what they say is very valid. But they say to me things like, well, the way civilization works is it's all built on the works of Shakespeare, leading eventually to Margaret Atwood. And actually, I say to myself, actually, this is not right. And I wanted to write a book which explained that the basis of all civilization is engineering. It is the entire basis of all civilization. From the hand axe, you can go to the BM, British Museum, and you can pick up and inspect a hand axe, a very beautiful object, which changed the nutrition of the human, through to go, as I did, go to look at the James Webb Deep Space Telescope at Goddard Space Center. It's not launched yet, but it's an amazing object. It's going to be folded up like origami. It's going to be launched into the second Lagrangian point, 1 million miles away from the Earth. It's going to spend 30 days unfolding, and then when it's ready, it'll be looking further than anybody else has ever looked. So it'll be even closer to the beginning of time. And those two things seem to me to be bookends of describing how we fill in the story of civilization between the two. And so I thought that engineering is actually the platform upon which everything else happens. Everything else happens. The platform has plenty of components, and we'll talk about that, I expect. But engineering is the thing which makes everything possible. So again, I'm very involved with people who spend their life discovering exciting things. But discovery in the laboratory is only one part of life, discovering new things. And engineering is the thing that sits between discovery and utility. So how do you use something? How does it make a difference to human beings? How does it make a market? And engineering is the thing that sits in the middle of it, looks in both directions, spins around, and figures out, this discovery makes this object. This discovery makes this software. This discovery solves this disease. This discovery allows me to assemble a new molecule, synthetic biology. So that is what engineering does. It sits in the middle, it's Janus-faced, looks in both directions, and it creates all the things that we actually get to use. So I've decided, I thought that was a big enough scope. It sort of covered everything. And then it was up to me as author to choose the bits that I wanted to write about. And they were all the things that in one way or another in my life I've been involved in. So I didn't write about anything that in some way I hadn't been involved in, because if you write with things you've been involved in, you can write in the first person. And that's always very good. And I could write about not just the past, but also the future. So quite a lot of it is about current issues.
Yeah, quite a lot. What's interesting as well is that, and I'll go on some subjects, you clearly met some people who disagreed about the future as well, so try and put both sides of the argument where the future is still slightly unclear.
Yes, indeed. So again, I thought it would be quite interesting to assemble all the people I'd met who were really interesting in the areas I was going to write on. So it's not possible to get them all in one place. I mean, the people I spoke to are some of the great people in the world, and all of them agreed to speak to me. So we went around, interviewed them all. I had an archive of probably 200, 300 hours of interviews with the greats in the world, whether it's Tim Berners-Lee, whether it's Norman Foster, whether it's people involved with drones, AI, medical devices, Bob Langer, a lot of people like that. So I interviewed them all, When I interviewed, I learned a journalistic point, which was not all interviews are useful. And actually, some have no content whatsoever. They're great fun until you actually write them out and you realize nothing has been said. And when I described this to Lionel Barber, he said, "And so what?" You know, he's the editor of the FT. He's done this a lot. He said, "And so what?" But most of them were very generous at their time, and they were contradictory, exactly as they should be.
Did you take notes or actually record them?
No, we recorded them and we transcribed them. Well, nowadays, of course, an engineering device allows you to transcribe pretty accurately, actually. You have to just clean up a bit. But no, it allowed us to transcribe and have a physical archive. We used only a small piece of it. That's very good to have.
Well, I'm going to start on energy, if I may. There are 3 chapters in it. There's a chapter called Energize. It's in the title, clearly, energy. But energy actually transcends quite a lot of the book, in a sense, not because of your book. It is the reality of energy. We think about transportation and buildings and everything else, etc. So, it poses a lot of questions about the conundrum we're facing at the moment, obviously, and the future. So I was intrigued about talking about cities as well as transportation. But if I go back, John, to the famous day in 1987, 97 rather, when you made your speech in Stanford, why has it taken the rest of the world so long to now realise that speech is a speech that's now you should hear almost on a daily basis?
I think it's to do with the enormous lag in response when you have a big legacy. Legacy, as you know, in business, is one of the most dangerous things to have. On the one hand, it's terrific. You know, legacy assets produce revenue. They produce their training for great staff, but they also anchor you in the past. And one of the big things about energy is that it's so fundamental to progress that there is a very big legacy. The legacy of, for example, using biomass for cooking in parts of Africa and the Indian subcontinent and killing people while they burn the stuff in small houses, through to coal, which probably should have been phased out faster than it is at the moment. And I don't mean metallurgical, I mean thermal coal, through to what we have today. And so people are reluctant to change because they believe they have to reinvent and reinvest in order to change. So in 1997, I gave a speech saying that the oil and gas industry is part of the problem of climate change, and they need to do something about it. And if they didn't, it would be done to them. And I committed BP to a set of actions, which we carried on and did. And then nothing much happened. People in the world said, well, that's very interesting. It's a real problem, climate change. Let's carry on. And it's only recently, I think, that people are beginning to take it really seriously. I think the reason for that is twofold. First, they see the weather changing, and they're worried that the weather may be a permanent change in the climate. And there are good reasons to suspect that. For example, the oceans are getting warmer. When I was in Abu Dhabi at this latest, I gave a speech there, I picked up the local newspaper, and tucked away in a corner was a little news item to tell us that the temperature of the Pacific Ocean, near shore Pacific Ocean, had risen by 2.8 degrees and had killed all the Chinook salmon. So it was a little example of something. Climate change wasn't mentioned in that article, but it just sort of said to me, there are lots of things going on here that could be rather existentially threatening to portions of the human race. So I think that's causing people to push their politicians for really the very first time, I think. This has been a top-down drive. Very often it's been good for you to do something about climate change, and people saying, well, maybe, but I'll do it later. Now I think people are saying it's actually good for us, and you politicians really need to do something really practical here. Now, I think when you look at the engineering side of this, I think several points. First is, nobody, I think, sat down 60, 100 years ago and said, let's alter the climate. This was not an intended consequence. It was an unintended consequence of the energy which was provided, which did some very great things. And secondly, people have in bits invented different engineering processes and products that, if used extensively, could take away the consequences of too much CO2 in the atmosphere and too much methane. We could actually reduce that level very clearly. And we have, I think, all the tools and techniques to do that: carbon capture and storage, carbon capture and use. We have energy control systems to reduce the energy intensity of a variety of processes. We have renewable energy, which is getting better and better. If we thought about it, we almost certainly have much safer, much lower cost fission reactors on a small scale, which can be built in factories and assembled on site. And so we have a lot of things that we could actually do. Of course, as you probably all have immediately realized, it's all terribly expensive. And it will only get cheaper if it's more and more of it's done. So one of the lessons of engineering, of course, is the learning curve. The more you do, the cheaper it is, with the exception of nuclear power stations. The more you make, the more expensive they become. But I think everything else reduces in unit cost, but you have to really deploy it. And for that, you need an incentive. And that's why I think everybody is now talking, as they should, about huge carbon taxes. And I think that is very important. Applying carbon taxes to give people a real incentive to stop putting carbon into the atmosphere. Mr. Macron tried a bit of that, and the yellow vests appeared, and there were riots. So I think you have to be careful what you do with that carbon tax. And if you redistribute it, this is not designed to raise money. It's designed to change behavior and redistribute the way in which economic activity takes place. So you simply redistribute the tax back to the population. And that is a proposal which has real currency, I think, in many quarters in the US, and I think is something that, with a bit of patience, unfortunately we don't have a lot of patience, might actually work. Yeah. And that could be but we can actually do this. Now, of course, we can do it better over time, but we can actually do it.
Yeah, it's just a shame we haven't got a model today. That's one says that they've done it, it's working, and the rest of the world can replicate.
No, but I think carbon tax is something which I think most you can do it by analogy. It's clearly something that will sign up to change behaviour, and I think all the tools and techniques, one way or another, are being used somewhere.
Yeah, that's fair. Can I just go back to what you said about renewable, because you cover in the book, of course, the great story of solar, which is a fantastic example, actually, I know, of engineering, mass production, learning curve, enormous cost reduction. So today it's almost equivalent to a fossil fuel generator in some parts of the world.
I think I spent a decade in renewable energy, just purely renewable energy, and I saw it go down to actually compete pretty well with gas-fired power generation. But I think, and it will get better. There's a lot of work going on, very clever work, about trying to make different solar panels take different wavelengths of light and sandwich them all together. And there's some very interesting stuff going on, so-called perovskites.
Perovskite, yeah, that's right. So on nuclear, just quickly, we could spend a evening on nuclear, so I always tend to just make sure we don't lose that point, because it is unique in the sense in that scaling up of nuclear has actually led to cost increases because they're so big and therefore they're so infrequent that you don't get some of the learnings. Are you a fan of modular smaller reactors? Is that the game changer?
I'm a great fan of small modular reactors, provided they're reasonably small. Small modular can be defined anywhere from 50 megawatts to 450 megawatts. At 450, which is half the size of a normal reactor, big scale reactor, it's technically small, but it's quite big, medium size. So I think smaller the better if we can really produce them on a self-contained basis, containing all the power generation as well, and the control systems in a factory. Put them on a truck, and then probably put them in a water pool, and connect them up and go for it. I mean, this is not going to be something that happens in someone's backyard. That's not the idea here. But the idea is to produce thousands of these things and get them on the learning curve, and then use the old sites to because they're secure and they've got utilities.
Okay, let me move on if I can. Talk of energy, buildings and cities. We know that 8% of the world will live in cities by 2050. It seems to me there's the standards of buildings, the buildings we build today versus the best available technology. Just an enormous gap, actually. We're still, not just in the UK, but worldwide, we're putting up buildings that are way behind where they could be, let alone the fact we've got a massive issue on housing and social housing. So we've got two problems. So how do you build really cheap buildings at the same time as you need to make them so much more energy efficient? You touch on that in the book, but I was searching for the magic answer, actually. What is it? Is it a policy that's required?
Partly, yes, but I think it's also to remember that cities are occupied by human beings, not by architectural models. And I think speaking to all the people involved with, every architect is really mostly concerned with city planning. They really are very concerned. And I think most of them, one way or another, say the way we're going about it at the moment is probably not the way we should be doing it for the future. So at one end, there's a wonderful architect, a Chilean called Alejandro Aravena, who has realized that the way to get people to work in a city and actually look after their environment is to engineer houses where only half is built and the other half can be built by the occupants. And that's actually quite a tricky thing because you can't allow anything goes. It's got to be fire safety and the utilities got to be there and all sorts of things like that. So that's sort of one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum is someone like Norman Foster, who says, actually, we need every single space has to be used. We need to grow food everywhere we can because we've got flat surfaces and it's very important to use them. And we should build people as close as possible together so they don't have to be transported over very long distances. And everyone in between. And I think a lot of people look back and say, well, how did we do this in the past? And what have we lost as more and more people come into a city? Cities are, setting aside the materials problem, of which there's been great advances, and we just don't use enough of the most modern techniques. It really is about thinking about the human being and how do you get more and more people into a closer and closer space without actually driving them to despair, actually.
I know you touch on, or Foster's as well, in a sense about the split in society as well, and the ghettoisation to a certain extent, where we're building very expensive properties in some cities that therefore, only holding part of society. It seems to be sort of a planning issue there as well, that some of the architects are very keen on.
Well, I think there's a sustainability point, which is about people wanting to live there, actually being there so they can do all the things they need to do at one place. There are some exceptions, with people who buy property as safe harbors and don't actually live there. if something goes wrong elsewhere. London is probably one of those places.
There's a theme that you picked up in your introduction to a certain extent as well, John, that engineering has done so much good for the world, and you and I spoke about this before in a sense, and at every major breakthrough, somebody's been a bit of a doom-monger and said, oh, this is going to be awful, it's going to have all these negative consequences, and you put them in the book, actually, how, of course, they were wrong and all those things didn't come to pass. If I come up to today and think about technology and AI, as you mentioned just now, are there things at the moment that you're worried about that we actually are in danger of potentially having some consequences that might be negative? And if so, what are some of the things that you think we need to be doing?
So I think in terms of true existential threats, there are very few. I think the two I picked today are climate change and antimicrobial resistance, where we can build all kinds of antibiotics. You can build them, you can engineer them, but actually we don't know how to engineer things fast enough to stop some of the bacteria that are being generated by abuse of antibiotics that may exist and hurt us very badly over a period of time. So I have these conversations with Sally Davis, who's the Chief Medical Officer, and we discuss which is going to get us first, climate change or AMR. But I think there may be a positive, they may actually happen together as well. There could be reasons. But I think I would step back and look at, all engineered products have intended consequences. People build them for a reason. And many have unintended consequences as well that need to be thought through very carefully. Some are just simply subject of hype. So people think that, if we have artificial intelligence that provides a certain way of getting the human to be the person right at the chain, at the end of the chain solving a problem rather than the beginning, so it learns from past experience, all sorts of things, but very specifically on one topic, you can leap forward and say, we'll have artificial general intelligence, and therefore we'll have a brain that will then eventually allow us, dominate us, and won't allow us to switch it off. That is way, way beyond anything actually conceivable today. We speak to all the people like Ed Boyden, who deals with the brain, trying to figure out anything about the brain. We know so little. We know so little. It's hit and miss what we're doing, and actually I think at the Crick, I think we certainly understand a fruit fly's brain, but not much beyond that. So there's a lot to do here, and I think just to generalize to artificial general intelligence is simply to scare people. Yeah. Secondly, I think, robots, so people are worried about robots doing bad things to us. I think we should have been worried about old-fashioned robots that were in big factories and big cages, because they were very dangerous things. They weren't allowed to go anywhere close to human beings. Nowadays, if you go to a car manufacturer, I'm sure plenty of people here in this room do, you see robots working with people to customize this so-called mass-produced, bespoke mass production, where you alter models in order to make them for you. And that's done with a human and a machine, because the human has a much more flexible and pragmatic processing capability, and get round corners much more easily. So that's another one. I mean, there are downsides and upsides, and people worry about jobs disappearing. So I'm always struck when you talk in a London audience, you get people saying, well, it can't be true. 120 years ago, the average working week in the industrialized world was around about 70 hours. It's now about 35 hours. And before anyone says, I work far harder than that, this is an average for the industrialized world. averages mean there are plenty of people doing 100-hour work, have work weeks, I'm sure, and some people doing none. But there's nothing wrong, therefore, with this work week going down to 17 and a half hours. There's nothing wrong with that. And actually, if we said there was something wrong with it, there's something wrong, I think, with us. I've always tried to do this thought experiment of imagining the grandees who owned all the land 120 years ago, sitting around saying, it'll be very dangerous, when the peasants only don't have to work 70 hours. What do we do to keep them occupied? That's none of their business. We actually figure it out ourselves. And we've been through this big alarm about what do we do with spare time for a lot of time. I think the problem is not so much what happens at the end of the process of change, it's in the transition. And the transition needs very great public policy care, much as the end of the process needs public policy care, which is you can't pay people the same hourly wage for half the hours and expect them to survive. So public policy has to change how you do that. But that will happen. I'm sure it will happen, and we can choose to make it happen.
There's a point you make about privacy, actually, which is interesting. I think it's Mark Walpole also makes the observation that the concerns around privacy are holding us back in terms of sharing medical data, which is holding us back on advances. So it seems to me we're at a bit of an inflection point, actually. The more concerned we get about privacy, the less likely we're to reap some of the benefits of sharing information and data.
So we haven't accommodated to new definitions of privacy. I think a lot of people sitting in front of a computer screen have in the past said to themselves, I'm anonymous. It doesn't matter, so I'm anonymous. It doesn't matter if I consent to all these details about what I'm doing because no one will know who I am. So I can pick perfume, I can pick baking soda, I can do all sorts of things. No one will know who I am. Of course, that is absolutely not true. They know exactly who you are. So we've given away a tremendous amount of privacy, but actually we've given it away over many, many years. I spoke to Vint Cerf, who's a good friend of mine, one of the inventors of the internet. We were meeting actually in the Folger Library in Washington, D.C., the great Shakespearean library. And he was saying, he said to me, when I was a kid growing up, we used to have a village postmaster. And, every time we got a letter, the village postmaster would say, I'm so pleased your uncle wrote to you. He didn't know. And then they'd make a long distance phone call and the telephone operator said, is everything okay with your sister? So it was always, there was never total privacy. So today, I think we have, we've given a lot of it away. We'd like to get some of it back. We really would. We worry about what people do with our data. But again, they've been doing strange things with our data for a very, very long time. And so, but people are objecting to data being used in ways to manipulate us. I expect people objected to the way in which newspapers were used to manipulate us in the past. We just haven't quite accommodated to this new way of doing it. But it will be around for a long time. I think where Mark Walpole, who's the head of UK Research and Innovation, is concerned is this, and I'm very concerned about it. In the end, I think the very biggest breakthrough we can make with ultra big data and AI is to try and understand how to diagnose an individual based on measurements that we can make without human intervention. And for that, it's not just a matter of genomic data that takes you so far. It's much more about everything that's happened to you. How many times you've been to the doctor? Do you exercise? What sort of environment do you live in? Lots of particulate matter or free, open countryside? Do you eat meat and do you eat fish? a lot of stuff that you will find is collected on NHS records for many, many years. So if we could find all this data and somehow put it together, we probably could get a fantastic system, but it's ultra big data, which would allow us to actually go beyond where first-line physicians are at the moment. First-line physicians could be right at the end of the decision chain. Most of this could be done by algorithmic methods. And I think that's the great challenge. And for that, people have to be convinced that their data will be given for the common good, not for exploitation, but for the common good. And as long as we keep that aspiration there, we can do something great.
Yeah, and that theme of, and at the end of the day, it's still a human being at the back end of this chain, even though you might have all the machines in the early part.
So I have glaucoma, and I have been being treated for a very long time. I get measurements made before I see a consultant. The measurements are now, there are so many of them that actually rather complicated algorithms will now give you all kinds of probabilities about whether or not the treatment's working, what are the chances of problems with your long-term problems of your eyesight, blindness, all sorts of things like that. And it's very accurate. So now I go and see the consultant, and he's right at the end of the chain. He's reading all the stuff, and he says, it's about right. That's 99% accurate, or 98% accurate. I'm here to adjust the last 2% and tell you about it. And that, he doesn't have to do the measurements. When I started, he did the measurements. I have to do that. And so he's right at the end of the decision chain. And that's exactly where he should be. And the interesting point is, of course, if you weren't there and no one was there and you made all these measurements, it would still be better than having no measurements at all. You know, you've actually democratized in some ways the ability to diagnose what's going on. And so I think all of this is tremendous. It will change the way in which I think we think of humanity and how we look after humanity. And, you know, it's very clear that a need will push this because we will run out of people to do what they're doing at the moment. As I spoke to Craig Venter, a great guy who, a great American biologist, entrepreneur, who actually pushed Clinton to do the human genome sequencing by saying, if you don't pay for it, the US government, I'll pay for it personally. So he pushed, you know, very hard. So when I interviewed Craig, I've known him for years, he first he wanted to sequence me and do all sorts of other things to me. And I said, I think it's unwise, Craig. I said, I've taken some advice. We need a specimen who is 25 years old, who has very few aberrations, and then we can work out, as you get older, lots of aberrations, they may not be relevant, so I don't want to find out about those. But his quote to me is, he said, I think medicine remains medieval, because not much has changed since medieval times. We don't bleed people anymore, but not much has changed. And his view, my view too, is that actually the thing that has changed medicine is engineers have saved far more lives than physicians, far more lives than physicians, both in the public health space, Bazalgette and the sewers, through to what happens when you go to hospital and you see all the equipment and how you're measured, MRIs, CAT scans, all these things are amazing things. And nowadays, how you can have medical devices that do extraordinary things.
There's robotics for surgery and everything. And it is one of the things I'm always interested in is the juxtaposition between what we used to think of sciences and engineering, and biology and engineering in particular to this point in medicine. How do you help young people think about new engineering rather than the engineering that their parents thought about in terms of its perception?
I talk a lot about this too. So I chair the Crick Institute, and the director's the great Paul Nurse, Nobel laureate, and we have it's a very, very great institute. We have some extraordinary people, but its remit is rather it's all about discovery. Our remit is to discover not how to fix cancers, but to figure out why they occur. Nobody knows that. The party question to ask anyone is, well, we know that that smoking causes lung cancer. Do you know how smoking causes lung cancer? Nobody knows. Nobody knows yet. So we think it's very important to discover these things. So that's very, very, very advanced stuff. So, but the only way we can do that is to have a whole bunch of very important people making machines to help make the discovery. So these are microscopes of extraordinary nature, and they have to be altered every time to do exciting things, like take movies of how cells divide and all sorts of things like that, which you can do. So the point I think we make is there's no boundary, that engineering is as physics, is as chemistry, is as biology. They're all the same thing. And if anybody thinks they can do one without the other, they're not thinking correctly. So at the Crick, we treat, if anyone's here from the Crick, they'd probably know that, we treat the people who look after our animals. We don't have mammals, we're little mice and fish and things. And the people who fix the microscopes and look after the microscopes, alter them, and the Nobel laureates in biology or medicine on exactly the same basis, because that's how it works now. And I think if people only just step back and looked at engineering, it's everywhere. It's absolutely everywhere. It's in your iPhone, it's in your every algorithm, every object, every diagnosis, every advance, every single advance in discovery is built on engineering to get there, whether it's space telescopes or whether it's microscopes. So I think it's really important that people understand that. You know, people say, well, you know, they say, well, software isn't engineering. It absolutely is engineering. And then they say, well, we understand that, but everything really, it's all virtual, you know, so think for a moment, it's not. Software is a product, and the cloud, as you know, doesn't exist. It's based on 60 years worth of hard labor to produce extraordinary machines and free memory stacked up in tens of thousands of data centers, all of which need to be made more and more advanced every day of the year. So that's a branch of engineering which is extraordinary and will grow, much as medicine is, much as the space discovery, much as defense, because defense always produces things which can be used for two things, for defense and war, and for peace and prosperity. They're pretty well everything has two sides.
Perfect segue into it's going to be my last question, actually. So I'm about to ask my last question. So, whatever, think about what you'd like to ask John in a moment. My last question is always kind of, you have to segue into. In 2030, when you're penning the 12th update to this book, I'm penning, hopefully, by pen as well. What's the chapter that you'd like to write and add that wasn't in the first one?
Well, I would certainly like to add a chapter which says we can diagnose all disease and we can do it in advance of them happening. I'd like that very much. And I'd like to write a chapter that we've cracked that. Big data and medicine go hand in hand, and we get it. We understand how to prevent things, which is, I think, wonderful. I think the chapter, it's probably too, well, no, it's not. that actually we now have got underneath the problem of climate change, that actually we understand how to keep power in the world still, but we have gone to the brink of existential threat and walked backwards from it, and we feel much better for that, and we've assured ourselves of at least another 100 years of existence.
So that's my two big existential threats. Right, I'm going to open it up to the floor. There's a microphone going around. If you could just state your name and your background, and who wants to ask you a question?
Hi, John. Okay. Hi, John. It's James Paul. I wanted to go back to your point on climate change, because I too have been following your view on that and was greatly lamented your decision to abandon Beyond Petroleum, which I thought was a great thing. But today, particularly in Europe, there is a great emphasis not on letting people come up with solutions, but dictating a solution. For now, for example, the simplistic one is all renewable, all electric, all battery, and all other zero carbon routes are ruled out. Now, the advantage of your carbon tax approach is that you don't do that. Just as in Southern California in the 70s, they thought, oh, let's get rid of smog by having electric cars, and they made very strict emission controls rather than dictating electric cars, and sure enough, engines got more efficient and electric cars came many years later. Is there some way that we can redirect policymakers to incentivizing a range of solutions, such as hydrogen, such as using the existing infrastructure, etc., rather than this very simplistic route that seems so attractive to so many people of just dictating a solution with what we know now and then ruling everything out, such as you're never going to get hydrogen boilers if we make boilers illegal in people's houses in 3 years' time.
So I think as a practical matter, we will still be regulating. I mean, I think, first of all, there's regulation and then there's directive regulation. I mean, there's preventive safety regulation. In other words, everybody is to do this so no one can take a free ride. But there's also this directive. And we never understand the consequences of the direction. So we say, all electric cars, where is the electricity coming from? What are we going to do? This was the German problem with the Energiewende. So what you do is you eliminate options and direct the outcome, and as a result, you, rather than burn less coal, you burn more coal. But you didn't mean to, but it was the consequence of direction. So I'm not in favour. I'm much more in favour of trying to change big levers and then filling up some of the. You have to direct some of it, but a smaller rather than bigger stuff, it seems to me. So I don't know. I think we are where we are, and there's a sort of political philosophy that will direct all this. Whether it actually produces the results, and we'll go back to say maybe we should change one or two very important things. Price carbon by taxation, that's important. We will have to encourage some industries, not all industries, to grow. Whether we get back to that, which I think we will, having tried some other things, let's wait and see. It would sure be good if a big economy, one or two big economies, just took a lead and demonstrated you could do it a different way. But I think banning, so policy has produced some very bad results. I do recall many UK governments saying diesel is the way forward, and being told that that's what we've got to do, and we've got to change the refinery slate in order to produce more diesel. So we didn't import as much diesel from the US. When I was working in the US, the EPA said diesel, never. Never. On the road diesel, out of the question. Off the road, maybe. So, you know, it was, no one listened to anybody, and look at what we've got now.
Please.
Sir John, thank you very much indeed. My name is Peter Dolan, and I'm an exploration geologist, which has got nothing to do with my question. I'm wondering if you have interviewed anybody in the insurance world. I speak because I'm a member of a cohort of 500,000 people in this country who participate in the British Biobank study, which you're probably familiar with, for the common good. I wonder when we can predict, as you were talking about, whether that will affect the way the insurance market reacts to our risks. And similarly, for example, in the news in the last couple of days, pollution levels by postcodes in London, which will obviously affect people's net worth and risks. So did you interview anybody in the insurance world and talk to them about how engineering affects the future?
No, because I concluded if I started doing that, I would have to, this book would have a natural tendency to become a business book. And I didn't want it to be that. I think, again, it's not a very straightforward answer, because we touched on a few people in this area just for reference. So, for example, there was a great move to believe that autonomous vehicles, which I may say they're not ready for prime time yet, not for a long time. They could be quite dangerous. But there was an early view that autonomous vehicles would take the heart out of the auto insurance market. Actually, it's probably quite the reverse at the moment. But I think the consequences are unclear. I would expect, so this is there will be major policy and ethical questions. If we can predict what's going to be wrong with you, can we still insure you against it? We obviously should. But people will say, well, the risk is too high because we know for sure. So I think that we has to be rebalanced somehow. But I think there is. The biobank is the first big step into big data and diagnosis. It's not the whole answer, but it's a big step.
The lady in front, please.
You probably get asked this a lot in terms of engineering and its reputation, and particularly in the UK. I think all of my career, people have been talking about how poorly engineering is viewed in the UK. Do you see that changing? What do you think it will take, other than lots of very good books, obviously, to make a difference?
Thank you. My publisher will be very pleased with you. But I think the most important thing is the confidence of engineers. In the end, we have to make sure that everyone who's an engineer is confident that actually that's a very important contributor to humanity. It's really important. And it should be on equal standing to anybody else who's contributing to humanity, and not feel lesser or greater. I think it's really important that. Secondly, where I do think we lack is role models of greatly successful engineers. It's interesting that of the Fortune 100 CEOs in the US, I think it's the case that around about half are qualified engineers and have practiced as engineers. I think that's quite an interesting point, that industry does produce things, and production is a part of engineering. It's enabled by plenty of other things as well. So I think its role models have to be really lauded, and then I think people say, I can do that, I want to be that, and also understand what they're doing. A lot of people going into software as a service, that is engineering. It is actually engineering. It is not actually a service as we've formerly known it.
Just pick up on, interestingly, when Lord Sugar made a wonderful remark that I've never met an engineer who could run a business, there was a survey done in the UK. It was 34% of the FTSE at that stage was actually run by an engineer. So it's a bit of a secret, I guess is what John's saying, isn't it? But do you think the Key Prize is, if you go back to that, because has it had that impact in terms of answering that question to the broader population?
No, it's pulling the top a little bit. First, it's not frequent enough. We can't afford it every year, which I keep wanting to make it every year. Secondly, it's the top of a system, and we have some gaps in the system. You know, it's a Nobel Prize equivalent. It's the equivalent to the Nobel Prize for engineering. It's global, so it's reinforcing. Many of our awardees are from the United States, so it's simply reinforcing what people know in the United States is that engineering is really important. So you know, we need to. That's why I think we need to be more frequent. Otherwise, we're not going to get through a backlog of people who really do deserve it. But we need to be more current.
Again,
we need to be
must
broader.
have shifted the fact that the internet found has got, and then biomedicine, at least shifted the perception of engineering from its old world, which you're referring to the Santoni, I think. So I buy that completely. It must have helped.
It's helped a bit. I think I'd like to see more of it. But I personally would also like to see a version of this for people who are more early in their careers, rather than have almost completed their career. And I don't quite know how to structure that, but I think
Engineer of the Year.
I don't like that tone. I prefer something about people who've been, I mean, it's sort of mid-career, something like that. It's
Okay. Next question. Do you want to go to Edward and then come forward? That's just for logistics reasons, nothing else.
John, I pick up some of the Edward Libby.
Yes.
I pick up some of the earlier comments. When do you think we're going to have the first engineer as a prime minister? And do you think perhaps with the pace of change of, if you reflect on your career, my career, things that are happening today were unimaginable when we were students? And that pace of change is going so fast, I don't believe politicians are capable of understanding the consequence of engineering and science on what happens. Hence, the endless mistakes. Diesel is just not one. I can think of a dozen political mistakes over the last 20 or 30 years where we've done the wrong thing because politicians don't understand 101 science. So a bit more, I mean, how do we change that such that PPE is not the preferred subject for prime ministers?
I think there are some countries, of course, that do have prime ministers, and China, for example, routinely has half the state council as engineers, actually almost all from the same two universities. But we haven't here. The political streaming, as it were, is very much based on different things, as you correctly say, degrees which are different than PPE, geography, things like that. Let me say, as a deeply committed engineer, I wouldn't want everything run by engineers because the problem, and you can see this in Facebook. So if you really say to people, because I can do it, I will do it, rather than because I can do it, I'll think about whether we should do it. I think there's a very important difference here, which is normally created by dialogue with people with other backgrounds. So that's one point. I do think that the understanding of what's achievable is very low, and I think people take not sufficient advice when they're trying to run a country from people who can say to them, here are different ways of thinking about things. We even have a problem of the vocabulary. So people talk about science and they think it's all happening in a lab. They don't think about what happens next. So I don't hear people talking about engineering, innovation, new products, new ideas. It's coming because in this country, for example, I sit on the board of UK Research and Innovation, which is this big accumulation of all the research councils and Innovate UK and things like that. When you look at the way in which research is done here, of course, first of all, every dollar that the government put in research has to be matched by at least $2 from industry. It doesn't work. But the action is not actually discovering things, it's making or doing something with it at the end of the chain. And to look to the future of the UK, we have to do very much more than that. We tend not to do it properly. We tend to sell companies before they've reached their promise. You know, people have been talking about how good we are at AI in this country, and I agree with that. I think we have some great people. But the four great companies that we invented in AI were all sold one after the other to US interests from this country. And that the four most important ones. So, and that's because I think we don't fully understand what it means to create value at the end of the chain. You know, that's what it is. And that requires a very different mindset from just making an announcement or creating something interesting intellectually. You have to produce something really impactful at the other end. So maybe that will change because of need. Maybe it will change because of need. And there are some glimmers of hope, I think, in this area. Not everywhere, I think.
Sorry.
Thank you, John. Medieval medicine, medieval education system, and how we approach creativity and innovation is very worrying, because the diversity is very much kind of, well, killed or not even encouraged at an early age, and I see that a lot in our educational system. So how do we feed and encourage creativity? But you know, and really kind of because you're talking about engineering in a much wider, with you know, and with passion. We've lost that passion. So how do we recreate that in our new generation and in our educational system?
Well, I think if I knew, I really would go straight for it right now, because. But I think there are several components. But first, I do think it's very important to pick a few role models for people to look at and say, whatever people tell me at home or at school, that's where I want to be. And we don't have enough of those, but we can create them over time. We can create them over time. That's really important. The second one, I think, is to stamp on inadvertent bigotry in this area. So I know when I was president of the Royal Academy of Engineering, we interviewed so many women who said, well, actually, at home, I was told that that's the boys' subject, because that's what the teachers kind of said. So we must stop all that. I mean, it's not the boys' subject, it's everyone's subject. And it's even more important nowadays to have a lot of real diversity in engineering. When I interviewed Fei Li, she was at Google, and now she's at Stanford. Her main point was in creation of what in effect goes into a black box, this AI systems that are self-learning, unless you're very careful, because you have to have weights and adjustments in the algorithm, you actually bias them with the gender of the writer. And you just got to be very, very careful that you don't do something that produces a really bad result, you know, through, let's say, court case analysis, things like this. So that's the second. I think the third is to, again, laud people who praise them when they create something really good, and not say, well, as indeed some universities still say, well, actually, we don't like practical things, you know, the sully our purity, and so we don't applaud people who do great things in industry, from the fruits of discovery through engineering to the market. And I think we need to do more and more of that. And if I can have 4 points, the final point, I think, is this. When you go to Boston and you go to San Francisco, you notice that an awful lot of engineers, their best friend is someone in finance, and they might well have been there themselves. But that doesn't mean to say they've given up engineering. they actually understand the both sides of the problem. And we need more of that. We need our education in management, widely stated, is not as good as it could be. In fact, it's not good. It's not good. And it needs to be upgraded hugely, I think, for the future.
Great question, thank you. There's another question on here, please.
Yeah, so I started as a petroleum engineer and then moved on to building simulation. But the thing I've never been able to get away from is how do we bring non-engineers in to our field? Because behavioural change is really quite important in what I do now, and I've really struggled with this idea about design of building controls that people understand. So how do we, not people that want to be engineers necessarily, but people who really don't want to be engineers, how do we almost get them to think like engineers without overcomplicating it?
So I think now, well, obviously with patience, first of all. I mean, I do think almost anything in any concept can be boiled down to plain words. But nowadays you don't have to do that. You can create a simulation, which you can have another human, look at product and experiment and do things like that. So I think we've got some interesting tools now to bring people into what we do. There's, these immersive visualizations are really exciting because they allow people to play with bits and actually see things that they couldn't otherwise understand if it were on a drawing or on a small screen. They actually get involved with it. And I think that I was involved with the early days of that in BP when we had a terrible time trying to get drilling engineers to speak to petroleum engineers on where wells should go. And if you could show them, then it would really made a difference.
I think it's the Hive in Aberdeen.
The Hive. So the first one was in Sunbury. Yeah.
Just make it more immersive.
I think you make it more immersive, or you can play a game, a simulation. I think that's important as well.
Jonathan Oxley, if your career had taken a different trajectory early on, was there ever another company you might have liked to have taken the leadership of, or another industry you might have liked to have taken a leadership role in?
It's strange. I mean, people ask me nowadays with a slight disdain and distaste, which says, surely you weren't in the oil and gas business. And my view is I'm actually very proud I was in the oil and gas business. Because oil and gas created some extraordinary opportunities for a very, very large number, actually about 5 billion people in the world. The difference between the number when I was born where we are today. So I think it's very important. But, every time I wanted to leave BP, people offered me all kinds of jobs. Somehow BP read my mind and offered me a better one, So I didn't change. Had I started today, I probably would do something different. I'm not quite sure what I'd do. I'd be much more in the business of trying to invent something. The only reason I really enjoyed BP is I was given the opportunity to do things other people hadn't done. And that was quite good fun because you could work without reference to some convention. And I think people need to be liberated in that way. That's why I think young people generally, or younger people, like to go into startups because there are no rules. There's something new to create. I don't see why big companies can't do that as well, actually. But I've always believed that. But the answer is no. I think what I now know today, I must say, I probably would have really attracted to the advances, the intersection of engineering and medicine and biology. I think that's the most exciting connection today. I think that would attract me if I started today.
Great question. Gentleman in front here.
Hi, John. Malwick Thomas here. Just, I guess, a sort of wider question on the, the energy dual energy problem. Really, I just wanted to get your views on what you think the investment frame, how the investment framework needs to change globally or within the UK to encourage things to move at the right pace, a pace that doesn't cause too much social unrest, but at a pace that will ultimately deliver us below a 2-degree scenario, for example. And I guess, how do you think about what needs to change beyond that, not just, I guess, in the energy sector, but certainly in the consumer and automotive sectors?
So I think one of the big things for most of energy systems, the big problem is it's capital up front and revenue later. So you've got to try and figure out how to reduce the risk for people who are putting capital up with a slightly uncertain outcome. You either make the outcome certain by buying all the output and doing something different, or you change the way in which the risk they have with capital. So that's where I think we need to do more. I think it's difficult politically. So, for example, if I found this in my dealings with Gordon Browne, we nearly, in BP, did the first large-scale carbon capture and storage project. And the only reason we didn't do it is that if they'd changed the tax incentives, which would be good for everybody, it would be construed by the general public that the UK government was giving this fat cat company called BP a subsidy. Now, that's true and false, because it's the industry as opposed. And so people are reluctant to do that. So I think we've got to get over that. It's another problem with legacy. It's tough to do with legacy, but we need to do that. So incentives are really important. I think going directly to pricing carbon is very important indeed. In fact, I think if we don't do that, we're not going to achieve the objectives. We absolutely are not. Because we need big levers. I was on American TV and I was slightly bumped by someone showing me a clip of Elizabeth Warren, Senator Warren, talking about climate change. And she said, basically, the problem is that everyone's doing displacement activity. Displacement. So the oil companies, which was incorrect, but she said the oil companies are wanting everyone to change a light bulb and thinks that they can get away with that. That's not true. And I was asked, do you agree? I said, I completely agree. We have to get onto the main event here. And the main event is getting rid of carbon somewhere else, either not producing it or taking it and storing it and using it. Until we get the incentive structure to do that, we're not going to get the right amount of change. We might possibly get some change done by top-down regulation, banning cars, doing this, doing that, but there will be consequences. There really will be consequences for that. So be careful to attend to the big event, it seems to me. And that's my advice to anyone who will listen.
Thank you.
Hi, John. Elena Rodriguez here. I was just wondering if, in your experience, and this is talking about machine learning, I was just thinking that what I have noticed is that when we teach the machine something and we get outcomes, we tend to choose the outcomes that are most human-like. I think that could be because we're afraid that machines will take over or because we think we know best. And I was just wondering if you think, or if in your experience you think that we may be missing out on some major breakthrough the machine may have made, but we discarded the outcome because we thought that the outcome was most human-like, was the right outcome. I don't know if you...
I think it very much depends on whether we believe the rules within which the machine is doing this are solid and accurate. So, I think we're very happy to be astounded by moves in Go and chess, where there are very strong rules-based activity. We are less committed to believing an outcome where, for example, all the accident data for all the oil companies is used to try and predict what the next potential outcome might be. We look at it and say, actually, that doesn't make sense. because there aren't actually, there are insufficiently strong rules. There are weak rules only, they're not strong rules. And as a result, they don't or sometimes make sense. I think if we believe in the strong rules, we believe in what's being learned, I think.
Okay, got one last question. At the back.
Thanks very much, Angela Love. I was wondering, we talked about top-down regulation and talked about hydrogen and heat and how we might have to change the energy system in the UK in respect of climate change. One of the other big issues there is about customer attitude and customer behaviour. And obviously you touched about, taxing customers and giving it to large corporates. How do you think we'll challenge customers to grab the nettle in this and actually understand what we're trying to do and, take hold of the situation and come with us on this?
So I think where public policy has yet to, because we're nowhere close there, is to decide where the incidence of taxes are so that behaviour can actually change. Clearly, if you tax purely the consumer, you're not going to necessarily get carbon capture and storage being put into a refinery. Probably not. But for the refiner, you'll get it done. But you might actually get more, but you'll get biased choices if you start taxing, let's say, natural gas against fuel oil. You'll get choices being made by the consumer. They have to have reasonable choices. And therefore, I think slowly it can be done that way. Top-down regulation can force it, certainly to the consumer. People say that because there are so many consumers, their behavior is uncertain, top-down regulation is the only way to go. I question that. But I think that a mix of the two will doubtless take place.
Thank you, John. Thank you. Wow, we've covered a lot of ground, I think, haven't we? For those of you that, would you desperately like to ask a question, sir?
I would, because I want to ask a philosophical question, not a technical question. My name is Scott Eversman. I'm up from Diversified Search. I look around the room and I see some friends that I've been good friends for 25 years, and I'm loving this. So anyway, my question is this. 2 weeks ago, as you know, Jamie Dimon was in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Financial Times, because the Business Roundtable had come out with a statement saying, look, it's not just about shareholder value alone. That it's actually about something more. And they left that a little bit ill-defined, but I'm just curious. I would love to hear your thoughts on what is the something more, and where do we find our guideposts and philosophical talismans to head us in that direction?
So I've always believed that the best corporations with the longest longevity are those that incorporate stakeholders in their decision-making. They just do. They do it in a different way, and I think that's what the Business Roundtable was trying to say. I don't believe in stakeholder management, because they don't manage your customers. You incorporate your customers, you incorporate people. But I believe firmly in the sentiment. Now, the question is, can we get it done? My last book was a book called Connect, which was just about this, and it tried to it criticized standardized ways of doing this, corporate social responsibility. I got Howard Davis, my friend, to give me a wonderful quote. He said, the problem is, John, it's 4:30 on a Friday when the board gets around to this. And I think we've got to take it up the agenda. I think the Business Roundtable is partly defensive because a lot of people are worried about the way in which corporations are working in the US, and the voice is getting a bit louder, even in the US. It's interesting, with a bit of history, remind yourself that before there was a period when this was common practice. Milton Friedman put an end to it. Said the purpose is profit, purely profit. But that was also the case, I may say, with the East India Company, which has been featured in several books recently. Profit, pure profit. but I think there's far more to it than that, because you've got to live in the environment that gives you the license to operate. And that's, certainly if you're a public company, if you're a big private company, your license to operate is a function of how you incorporate your stakeholders in your decision making. So I applaud it, and let's see what happens next.
A lot about selecting the leaders who have a social purpose at the heart of them, I think, which is quite hard to teach as well, isn't it? John, in fact, as no diversion or kind of conversation this evening, I think anyone who hasn't read the book, I suspect you're very enthusiastic to read it. Now, there's a comment in the introduction by John Hennessy, who's the chairman of Alphabet, which says, "An ode to the ways in which engineering has improved human civilization," which, of all the things that are in the front of the book, I think that is just the best way of summarising the book, John, actually. I'm so pleased we touched on engineering as well. Those of the engineers, I think we're all very, very passionate still about the misunderstanding, the wrong position we've got engineering in our society. And the UK is probably one of the worst places in the world for that at the moment, actually. We have covered a lot of ground, but we are in the Energy Institute. So I'm going to just end with energy. There were a couple of things in the book. There's a quote, actually, by Pope Francis, which I wrote down here somewhere. "Civilization requires energy, but energy use must not destroy civilization." At the heart of some of the things we've talked about this evening. But it's the role of the Engineering Institute, as much as anything else, I think, to help the energy industry stand up to the challenges that we now face. And make sure that the world understands as well that the people who are going to solve this conundrum, the people who are going to move to your question, so the energy industry from energy industry to the past to the future, are going to be engineers. And we should probably get them all to read the book and realise, therefore, the obligation they have to move things forward. Hopefully, it will also enable the industry to attract people who genuinely want to help civilization going forward. John, it's been superb. Thank you so much indeed. John's going to hang around and sign a few books for any of you that aren't joining us upstairs, but I'm sure you'll join me in just saying a huge thank you to your time with us this evening, John. Thank you so much.